Paul is standing on Mars Hill in Acts 17, and older translations will say, the time of this ignorance God once winked at, God overlooked, but now he commands all men everywhere to repent. And then here comes the next thought, in that he has appointed a day in which he will judge the world by the man, Jesus Christ. And a couple of things to me really stand out in that section. One is, having gone back and ascended and sitting on the right hand of God, he is still described as a man. God will judge the world by the man, Jesus Christ. Paul will talk to Timothy and say there's one mediator between God and man, the man, Jesus Christ. And what to me is just so profound, and again, explaining this to small children, I would tell them before Bethlehem and before the incarnation, Jesus is God, he's all God. But after his birth, he is God-man, and will never go back to being God. Forever changed, forever different. And the man through which God is going to judge the world is on trial today. How ironic. And in the same way that we've said God the Father has never been hungry, never been thirsty, never been tired, then God the Son has. And a part of his qualification to be our high priest is that he was made in every way, even as we are, and yet without sin, from Hebrews. And how ironic, the experience of being judged is going to be a part of his background for being the judge. Isn't that ironic? And there's a real sense, and this is in John, where, and we have these wonderful terms through the New Testament. We've talked about Gethsemane, and today is going to be Gabbatha, and Gabbatha is the pavement, the judgment seat. And then, Lord willing, there'll be Golgotha that will come later. But through the experience of all things that he had of being judged unjustly, then he is going to become the most just judge that there's ever been. And here's something just to kind of think about. There is a sense in which it's very clear that there are things that are always wrong and there are things that are always right. And there is a sense of absolute judgment. But one of the verses that, and I use the word haunts me in a good way, one of the verses that I always think about is, with the measure you use will be measured to you. Oh, judge not that you be not judged, for with the measure you use, it will be measured unto you. And rather than just having an absolute standard of right and wrong, which is still there, how fair is it for God to use our measure that we've used on other people on ourselves? Understand what I'm trying to say? Yes, certain things are always right and wrong, but he's very clear. With the measure that you use, it will be measured unto you. And so I tell people, when it comes to either forgiveness or grace or mercy, I don't want a spoonful, I don't want a cupful, I don't want a shovelful, I want a front-end loader full. Because he who rejects me and receives not my sayings, John 12:48, has one that judges him. The words that I have spoken will judge him on the last day. And it is appointed for each man to die. And what comes next? And then comes the judgment. If you have the outline, we're going to start on the back page because by the time we get to the end, the Calvary is sometimes coming in, and there's a lot of noise. So there's some things here I just want us to highlight and to look at. There are several verses. This is under number 7. There are several verses, statements that are made during the trial that are so striking, and any one of these could be the entire lesson all on its own. It was Caiaphas, John 18:14. Caiaphas advised the Jews that it would be expedient that one man should die for the people. How ironic. Rather than having a riot, rather than having trouble, it'd just be better if we just kill a Jew every now and then. Having no idea this is literally the Son of God. Words out of the mouth of the high priest. Pilate, 27:11, are you the king of the Jews? And here's just a couple of things to notice, and I'm in Matthew for a second in my mind. What is literally the first verse in Matthew? This is the beginning of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And Matthew knows his history, but he says he's the son of David and then the son of Abraham. And throughout the book of Matthew, Jesus will be the king. When the wise men came from the east, they were looking for who? He who is born King of the Jews. And for the people who read Matthew for the first time, they don't have Mark and Luke and John to compare. And you read through, and Jesus as the son of David, the king, is emphasized all the way through the book of Matthew. And then here, those who came to worship the King of the Jews, now Pilate at the end of Matthew is asking, are you the King of the Jews? And then in mockery, what are we going to see? Purple robe, crown of thorns, and what's going to be the inscription on the cross? The King of the Jews. And as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, they who worshiped him after his birth, Matthew's going to close by saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And the sense of, are you the King of the Jews? We would say yes, and the King of the Gentiles, and yes, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But this is during the trial. Another thing, though, just this last week, and it's always amazing as we read Scripture because things that have been there for thousands of years just all of a sudden click. Jesus is the son of David, the son of Abraham. And what were the 3 promises God made to Abraham in Genesis 12? I'm going to give you children. I'm going to give you land. And through you, what's going to happen? All nations will be blessed. And what's the last words of the king? Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel. And so both the promise that is made to Abraham 2,000 years later, that through you I'm going to bless all nations, this is going to be fulfilled as the son of David, the King of Kings, gives orders to his disciples. You go into all the world, and in going there, what are we going to do? We're going to fulfill the promise that God made to Abraham 2,000 years before Jesus. Mark 15, 9 through 11. He answered them, Pilate is, do you want me to release to you, and here it is, the King of the Jews? For he perceived that it was out of envy that the chief priest had delivered him up. But the priest stirred up the crowd to have him release for them Barabbas instead. And we mentioned this, and Lord willing, it'll probably be something else we'll do in a Lord's Supper later. Bar, son of, the insurrectionist, the murderer, who is in prison, his literal name means the son of the Father. So we want you to release to us the murderer who's Barabbas, the son of the Father, and the Son of God, then let's crucify him. And again, the irony, both in name and in action, is always stunning. Luke 23:12 tells us Herod and Pilate became friends that day. Isn't this interesting how Jesus is able to bring people together? And, like, for example, here we are, people from all different walks of life and everything else brought together by Jesus today, and both in terms of believers and enemies, then Jesus had the ability to bring people together. Oh, Matthew 27:25, I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And this just makes you have the chills. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and our children. Oh, you can just hardly imagine the consequences of that. I would assume a part of that is that within 4 decades, the entire city of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. John 19:12, from that time on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. So we're going to come back to this in just a second. Herod and Pilate are going to become friends, and the leverage and the threat, which probably ultimately had a lot to do with the crucifixion, was the statement, you are not Caesar's friend. And we'll look at some things about that in just a second. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. Let me just drop back a couple of centuries. Antiochus Epiphanes is the king up in Syria. And when Alexander the Great died, 323, 321, his empire was divided into 4 parts, and Egypt belonged to the Ptolemies. There's a silent P, like pneumonia, Ptolemy. The Ptolemies have Egypt, and the Seleucids have Syria. And they always fussed and fought, and the nice place to fight is Palestine, Israel. And so initially, Israel's controlled by Egypt, by the Ptolemies, but later the Syrians take over, and Antiochus Epiphanes, who referred to himself as the Great One, the Jews changed a couple of vowels and called him the Mad One. Antiochus Epiphanes comes from Syria, and he's going to slip into Egypt and take over Egypt, he thinks. And when he gets there, there's a Roman general in the garrison. Whether true or not, but what is said in history is that the Roman general took his sword out and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus and said, before you step out of this circle, you decide if you're going to go home, and we would say, mind your own business, or if you're going to fight the Roman Empire. We're already here. You know the expression, the husband got mad at his wife and kicked the dog? You ever heard something kind of like that? He's really frustrated and upset, so he goes back to Jerusalem and he offers a pig on the altar in the temple. Now just, if you have any Jewish sensibility at all, just think about that. A guy comes through, invades the temple, and offers a pig, unclean, on the altar in the temple, and that sparked the Maccabean revolt. And Mr. Maccabees and 5 sons, and I think he and at least 3 of them are killed, and it's a lot like Vietnam. It's guerrilla warfare, small group of Jews, but they are so angry at what happened, and they eventually win. And on December the 25th, 163 BC, they have taken over Jerusalem, taken over the temple, and they cleanse the temple of the filth, which would include Gentiles, the blood of the pig, and that is Hanukkah today, or in the New Testament called Feast of Dedication. So in the Gospel of John, you will find in chapter 10:22, Jesus was walking through Jerusalem and it was cold. It was the Feast of Dedication, having nothing to do with Christmas whatsoever. December 25th then became the Feast of Dedication, in which we have dedicated, we have cleansed the temple, because we have no God but God, and we are not going to submit to having pigs and stuff offered on the altar. And then in order to get rid of Jesus, the blasphemy that they charged Jesus with is stated by the Jews. Oh, we have no king but Caesar. They fought an entire war just previous about that whole issue, but they are willing to do whatever it takes. There's nothing out of bounds. There's nothing that they won't stoop to. And they're going to cry, we have no king but Caesar. John 19:15. Luke 23:16. He released the man who had been thrown into prison. And notice the different writers will give us different details. Luke is going to tell us for insurrection and murder. This is Barabbas. And for whom they had asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. Then a couple of statements in the interaction between Jesus and Pilate. Bless their hearts. And I say this empathetically, not critically, but there's a whole group of people who believe that there's going to be the 1,000-year reign and the return and the Antichrist and all this other stuff. And seriously, I haven't seen one in decades. If you ever see that bumper sticker, if the rapture happens, I want your car. Because in an earlier generation, what did the bumper sticker say? If the rapture comes, this car will be unmanned, meaning, part of us are going to be taken, and then there's going to be the 1,000-year reign, all this stuff. And if it's appropriate, when I talk with people, I tell them, if Jesus comes back on earth, he lied to Pilate. What did he tell Pilate? My kingdom is what? Not of this world. And so, yes, we belong to a spiritual kingdom, doesn't have geographical boundaries, doesn't have different access. And I always think of this type of thing, especially when we come back from Australia. We land in usually Los Angeles. And what does the line say? Citizens and non-citizens. And your passport divides you up, and you have to go into, we're back into the boundaries of a earthly kingdom, an earthly nation. And Jesus is very specific. My kingdom is not of this world. And there are groups of people who have a herd of red cattle to have the red heifer ready to sacrifice to, it's all going to take place in Jerusalem, and it just goes on and on and on. But Jesus is very specific with Pilate. My kingdom is not of this world. Oh, so you are a king? John 18 going into 37. Well, you say that I'm a king. For this purpose I was born. And isn't this interesting? For this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. And everyone on the side of truth listens to my voice. Remember the little man up the tree? The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. There's about 15 or 16 of these I came to. We love the one in Luke 19, and very appropriate. But there's a whole group of these where Jesus says, I came to, this is the reason I was here. And he tells Pilate, I came to bear witness to the truth. And how amazing. What is truth? Doesn't that question illustrate so much of contemporary society today who don't believe that there's anything as absolute truth? And what do you hear? Well, you have your truth and I have my truth. And you talk with people and you just hear that type of thing all over again, over and over. And I just hear Jesus and Pilate talking, and that question, what is truth? And nearly every time I read this, I think, Pilate, you're looking at him. I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No one comes to the Father except by me. And that question illustrates so much of our contemporary society today. And then Pilate then goes out to the Jews and says, I find no fault in him. And this point is going to be repeated a number of times. And then that verse in Isaiah 53 just kept echoing while reading this. Despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and then what's the expression? Acquainted with grief. And no better illustration of that than the trial. Okay, now that we've done the end, let's start at the beginning and kind of work our way through, and we'll see what we have time for. The unjust trial of Jesus is a part of his path to the cross. And a part of what we said last week about Gethsemane is that Jesus did not get to the cross without having gone through the Garden of Gethsemane first. And what I mean by that is this: Father, not what? My will, but your will be done. The victory, let's say it this way, the physical victory of the salvation of the world is actually going to take place within the heart and the will of Jesus before he ever gets to the cross. And there's a sense that all of us will need to have Gethsemanes in our life where we either put to death, we crucify, we choose to do the Father's will, because, and how appropriate is this, the spirit is willing, but, and what comes next? Flesh is weak. And that's why, if any man would come after me, he must deny himself. And I think of that in terms of Gethsemane. Take up his cross, and Luke says, daily, and then follow me. Well, in the same way that for our Lord, Gethsemane preceded Golgotha, Gabbatha, the judgment seat, is also a part of that. And one of the things I just want us to notice as we go through this, God is going to fulfill promises literally all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Bruise your heel, he's going to do what? Well, I will do what to him? Bruise his head. Promises made to Abraham, these will go on and on. God is going to fulfill the promises of Scripture for hundreds and into thousands of years without ever violating the free will of the people involved. And is Judas chosen because he has sticky fingers? And given the right opportunity, he will betray Jesus out of his own motives. And God doesn't force him, God doesn't trip him, and God doesn't trick him. But the people who are involved in both Gethsemane, the arrest, the trial, are all allowed to function under their own free will, but unknown to themselves. And just like Caiaphas, oh, you know, it would be good if one man died for the people. Having no idea of Isaiah 53, having no idea, oh, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world, but just under his own circumstances, he will choose to do the things that has been in the mind of God before he said, let there be light. At times when we've taught 5- and 6-year-olds, and again, we talked about this briefly earlier, we sing day one, and we get someone to stand over here and sing, day one, God made light when there was one, and sing through the days of creation. And then we ask for a volunteer to be Jesus or God, and we put him on the other side of day one and say, before God said, let there be light, it was in his mind and in his plan. Paul will talk about this in Ephesians as the eternal purpose of God. And the eternal purpose of God, before he says, let there be light, is going to be fulfilled through the trial and the crucifixion, and the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world is going to die on the cross. And through that whole process, God never violates someone's free will. Everyone chooses to participate in the way that they do. These first 4 things I want us to look at are a bit of historical background. And when I read through especially John's account, and I think of leverage, you know, even if you have on the farm, we move big rocks and other stuff. And if you get the right crowbar in the right place with leverage, you can do something with a crowbar that you can't physically do yourself. And so the Jews are going to have some leverage on Pilate. And let's look at a couple of things that take place. Augustus, and he's going to die in 14 AD, originally Octavian, becomes into the Roman Empire leadership when he's 18 years old. And through his life, he has 2 physical sons, and both of his physical sons are killed. Adoption in the ancient world was never done with babies. Okay, get ready. This is gross. Just get ready. In every town of any size, there was a place where you just dropped off unwanted babies. Okay, it's gruesome. And if somebody wanted to pick up a baby to raise to become a slave, if you wanted to pick up a girl for prostitution, if you're a witch and you want body parts, I mean, this is terrible. But they never adopted babies. Adoption in the first century was more like the NBA draft. If you have 3 girls, but you need a son, why adopt a baby? He might grow up to be a wimp. Wait till he's 18, 20 years old and see how he develops and what he's doing. And adoption, especially among the Roman elite, was only done with particularly young men who were big and strong. And if 1 or 2 of your boys had been killed along the way, you might adopt. Well, in his will, and this wasn't stated fully until he died, Augustus adopted Tiberius as his son after his 2 blood sons were killed. And so when his will is read, Tiberius is 55 when Augustus dies. And so the transition from the Emperor Augustus to Tiberius takes place. And so when he begins being emperor, he's 55 years old. Okay. Nobody stoned me, okay? But as he gets older and cranky, okay? And he starts becoming unstable and becomes unhappy. And the last 10 years of his reign, he is going to actually leave Rome and go to the island of Capri and actually live most of the time out of the city of Rome. He didn't want to be bothered with all the mess and everything else. And so there were kind of delegates and other people who kind of ran the empire. So the emperor is, this can always get you in trouble. He's getting really old. He's getting into his 70s for the first century. And he's becoming more capricious. He's becoming just more unstable. And guess what happens when you tell someone you are not Caesar's friend? We all know that Caesar isn't well. And you see, or starts talking about in terms of leverage. And the statement I said is that he became, this last decade, more and more temperamental and spent the last 10 years away from Rome. He's easily agitated. Secondly, the appointments made by the Caesars, and this is what Augustus did. He realized that when Julius Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, he had acquired too much power. And so what Augustus did, he said, well, I'll take part of the empire and then we'll give part of the empire to the Senate. And so if you are a prefect or a governor, as Pilate is, you answer to Caesar. If you are proconsul, as Gallio is in Acts 18, you answer to the Senate. And what a proconsul is, for really from 753, especially after 510 BC, the Roman Empire had always been run by 2 consuls, and the consuls would be selected from the Senate. So let's do something recently. A proconsul would be very much like Congress sending Robert Kennedy to be the ambassador in England when he was alive. He's been in the Senate for a long time. He doesn't need the blue book. Everything's done by tradition. And so if you see someone is a governor or a prefect, he has been appointed by Caesar and his friends. And so the very first thing that Augustus did was that he wanted control of Egypt, and because only 3% of Egypt is inhabitable as the Nile runs through, the snow in the mountains to the south would melt and the Nile would rise, and even when the rest of the empire was under famine, Egypt was the breadbasket. when you go back up to Syria, up into Mesopotamia, were the Parthians, and the Romans never did defeat the Parthians. And so what they felt like, and this was Augustus, let's also have Palestine, because if we have an invasion, we'll have some people to slow them down and sacrifice a few Jews in the process until we can get our soldiers into Egypt if they decide to take over Egypt. So, because the desert on one side of the Mediterranean, as it had been for centuries, Israel was a buffer zone. And the reason that Pilate is in Palestine, keep peace at any price. And because of all the things that had taken place, then this inner circle of friends of Caesar would choose governors. Now, if you have your outline, you see Cornelius Gallus about 10 lines down on the right-hand side. Cornelius Gallus was a very well-known poet in Rome. He was one of Caesar's friends, and he was offered to become the governor, the prefect of Egypt. And so Cornelius Gallus goes to Egypt. He becomes the prefect. Kind of use the term, he gets a bit of the big head, and he starts building statues and monuments to himself and all this other stuff. And at a point in time, Augustus, Caesar, says, you are not my, guess what? Friend. And Cornelius Gallus commits suicide in Egypt rather than the embarrassment of going back to Rome and not being Caesar's friend. So within their own territory, within their own area, just a few decades later, someone who was in Pilate's position, Cornelius Gallus, the friendship of Caesar is renounced, and the consequences were so severe to Cornelius Gallus that he literally commits suicide before he goes back to Rome without being Caesar's friend. When you look at number 3, Pilate had also been appointed, and there would always be a network of people who would do this, by a man named Sejanus. And he was appointed in 26 AD as the governor of Judea. And Sejanus is an advisor to Tiberius. And guess what happens? He becomes a part of a revolt and rebellion, and Sejanus is going to be executed by Tiberius. So follow the line. If the guy who appointed you to be governor has become an enemy of Caesar and has been executed, all of his appointments are under surveillance to see if any of the people he appointed have the same things about him. So even the person who literally was responsible to Tiberius to get Pilate the position has been executed. And so look at this leverage. If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. And the last thing is this. Pilate is going to be the governor from 26 to 36. And during this time, there are 6 major confrontations that he and the Jews have with each other. The one with Jesus is number 3. So they've already had 2 unpleasant encounters, and there's going to be 3 more to come before they get him deposed. And this is kind of like a wrestling match. Both sides are unhappy with each other. And I just said there's an atmosphere of distrust and one-upmanship between Pilate and the Jews that already exist. But every time I read this, you are not Caesar's friend, then I literally think of having this crowbar. You can really lift a heavy rock with the right kind of leverage. And that may have been the tipping point that caused Pilate to feel like, well, if I have to tell Tiberius I killed a couple of Jews to keep the peace, I'll still have my job. And I think that's part of the background for why Pilate's going to be involved in that part of the crucifixion. So we'll do these quickly, and I'll leave these for you to look at, to be able to read. And this is Dr. Luke. A lot of these, not all, but a lot of these will come from Luke. But remember, Dr. Luke writes to most excellent Theophilus. And when we come to the book of Acts, who is most excellent? Felix and Festus. And I think Theophilus was in some type of judicial court-type setting within the Roman Empire, and very well may have been the benefactor that helped finance the support for the writing of Luke and Acts. But in the book of Luke especially, there's very careful charges, things are laid out that if you're a person who is most excellent, you're going to look at these and say, oh yeah, oh yes. Our oldest daughter is an immigration attorney. Incidentally, she's going to have plenty to do for the rest of her working career. And there are just things that come up, both in the news and otherwise, and I can just say, Heather, okay, Heather, what does that mean? And if that's your job as an immigration attorney and just working through all this process, and like 3 times she's told people, even if grandma dies, do not cross the border, do not go back. And she's had people call her from old Mexico and say, Heather, they won't let me in. And she's saying, I told you, don't go back. And then if you're an attorney, do you say, wade the river? You know, so it's just one of those things that just, but in that whole area, she's very familiar with that because that's what she does every day. Well, in the same way, anticipate, we're going to have this major trial in Luke, and there's going to be a number of trials in the book of Acts, and Theophilus is going to sit there and say, oh yeah, I understand. So notice this, the Jewish trial has 3 phases as we bring Jesus to the judgment seat. First one, they send him to Annas, and Annas is going to be the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who's the current high priest. The Romans deposed one, put in his son-in-law. What was the law in Leviticus? You remain high priest for the rest of your life. And so whether it's out of respect or whatever else, the first part of the Jewish trial is that rather than taking him to the current high priest, can I use the word emeritus? If you're around a university, sometimes a retired president will be emeritus and will still be involved. And so the first phase of the Jewish trial is we send him to the former high priest, either out of respect or hopefully for the judgment that they'll get. And so you'll find this in John 18 and starting in verse 13. The arrest has been made, who knows? It's after dark, maybe early in the evening. And the second part of the trial, Caiaphas has a part of the Sanhedrin together. And you'll see this both in Mark 14:53, Matthew 26, Luke 22. And when you read these, the false witnesses came, and none of the witnesses are going to agree. The statement about the Son of Man, Jesus is going to be accused, he's going to be mocked, he's also going to be beaten in that trial. And then to make it legitimate, the third phase of the Jewish trial is that the technicality is, and not just the technicality of the law, you're not supposed to have a trial at night anyway. So they wait till the sun comes up, the full Sanhedrin meets, he's condemned, and then they send him to Pilate. The political trial has 3 phases: Pilate, Herod, Pilate. And you can read through those and the consequences that were there. Then Luke tells us that there were 3 formal charges, and you'll see this in Luke 22. They're going to say, he subverts our nation, Luke 23:2. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar, and he claims to be Christ the King. And then Pilate is going to do 3 things to try to avoid handing him over. And there's going to be Herod, he's going to flog him, and then he makes the offer then to release to them Barabbas. Then if you look at the next page, Pilate also is going to make 3 attempts to release Jesus. And 3 times you're going to hear, either this man is innocent or I don't find anything worthy of guilt about him. And the thing that's interesting to me is that, you remember the Jews say, under our law, we're not allowed to kill somebody. Well, what'd they do to Stephen? There were cases where they stoned people or they killed people, but what they're actually saying is, we don't want to just kill him, we want to crucify. And you as the Romans are going to have to be the ones who do that. So if you look at the very bottom of that page, here's in hindsight. Pilate's wife says he's a righteous man. One of the thieves is going to say he did nothing wrong. The centurion is going to say this man was innocent. And then the crowd's left beating their breast out of the frustration of what they had seen with the death of Jesus on the cross. So I'll leave you some things to look at on this next page, and then we'll finish up. There's a whole group of things that are very ironic, virtual contradictions. But if you'll notice halfway down the next page, Matthew's going to focus on 4 characters: Caiaphas, Peter, Judas, and Pilate. And then there's going to be a transition in terms of the ongoing part of the trial. Here's the last thing. Pilate, after all the things that have happened in the Gospel of John, brings Jesus out to, and it's either the pavement, the judgment seat, but in Aramaic the word is Gabbatha. And the actual decision to hand Jesus over is made on the pavement or Gabbatha. We did this last week, but it always crosses my mind. Jesus is standing in Pilate's hall, friendless, forsaken, betrayed by all. Hearketh what meaning the sudden call? What will you do with Jesus? And the irony is that when the trial takes place, it's appropriate to ask, who's on trial? Pilate thinks he's in charge, but Jesus only gives them enough information to make sure that he's crucified. Thank you very much.